Welcome everybody to this latest in the New Books in the Arts and Sciences series. Tonight we are celebrating recent work by Lauren Robertson, namely this, Entertaining Uncertainty. Entertaining Uncertainty in the Early Modern Theatre, Stage, Spectacle and Audience Response, which is out from Cambridge University Press now. Yeah. I'd want to thank, my name's Alan Stewart, by the way. I teach alongside Lauren in the Department of English and Comparative Literature here. I want to thank the organizers of tonight's event, the Society of Fellows and the Hyman Center for the Humanities, and the co-sponsors, our department, English and Comparative Literature, and the Office of the Divisional Deans in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. For those of you who haven't been to one of these events before, I'll just quickly explain the running order, which is precision timed. After I introduce everyone very briefly, our author will introduce her book, and then we'll have a series of responses from our distinguished panel. Then our author can respond to said comments, and then we'll be opening it up for a Q&A session from the in-person audience here. So if you could start thinking of your questions now, and we could get rid of that 20-second pause that always happens when I suddenly throw the floor open. That would be very useful. So our panelists tonight, and I'll come to our author last. Jeremy Lopez is Professor of English at Montclair State University. He's the author of numerous books and essays on the drama of Shakespeare and his contemporaries, and the general editor of the Routledge Anthology of Early Modern Drama. Since 2018, he has served as the editor of Shakespeare Quarterly, the flagship journal in the field of Shakespeare Studies, so we're all nice to him. Julie Crawford is the Mark Van Doren Professor of Humanities in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia. She works on 16th and 17th century English literature and culture, and is the author most recently of how do you want to do it? Mediatrix, I will go for. Women, Politics and Literary Production in Early Modern England. W.B. Worthen is the Alice Brady Pels Professor in the Arts and Professor and Chair of the Department of Theatre at Barnard College, as well as the co-chair of the PhD program in theatre at Columbia. He's the author of many books on dramatic literature and performance theory, most recently his 2020 monograph, Shakespeare Technicity Theatre. And today's star, Lauren Robertson, is Assistant Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia. She researches and teaches the literature and culture of early modern England, with special interest in the plays and playwrights of the London Commercial Theatre, theatrical convention and stagecraft, intellectual history, skepticism, early modern classicism, and translation. She's published articles in Shakespeare Studies, Renaissance Drama, Shakespeare Quarterly, and the Palgrave collection Publicity in the Early Modern Stage. And she is now the author of the reason we're here tonight, Entertaining Uncertainty in the Early Modern Theatre, Stage, Spectacle and Audience Response. Please welcome our speakers.
Thanks, everybody. First, I'd like to say thank you to the Hyman Center and the Society of Fellows for making this event possible, especially to Lindsay Schramm for doing so much of the work to organize it, and to Sylvia Gindick for ensuring its smooth operation. Thanks to Julie, Bill, and Jeremy for joining me as panelists, to Alan for introducing us. I'm really honored to have some of the book's ideal readers here as respondents tonight. And thank you, of course, to everyone here, both in the room and online. I'm moved to see so many people who helped make the book possible in the whole range of ways that I now know writing one is necessarily a communal endeavor. And students and former students who are here, you are included in that description. Thank you for being here. So despite the book's title, Entertaining Uncertainty, I began this project from a position that early modern studies knows quite well. The field's very name describes an era of profound epistemological upheaval, a period in which orthodox modes of thought, rooted in the texts and practices of a remotely ancient world, began to jostle uncomfortably against the methodologies and disciplines that would usher in a recognizably modern one. The expressions of this paradox of early modernity's vestigial nascence are familiar. The Protestant Reformation, the Elizabethan succession crisis, the emergence of empirical science, all of these historical shifts were capable of provoking the people who lived through them into doubt, suspending them between possibilities that set the old against the new, the familiar against the strange. So that's what I knew. What I didn't know and wanted to understand was the aestheticized form such crises of knowledge took. What did early modern literature offer to this broader cultural circulation of doubt? This question, I should acknowledge at the outset, has a deceptively obvious answer. To locate instances of the mirror held up to the nature of early modern uncertainty, we might suspect, we need only look for representations of doubting characters. It's not for nothing, after all, that the most famous soliloquy in the whole of English literature is about the stymieing effects of one particularly melancholic man's uncertainty. Hamlet's to be or not to be speech verges on the other way that this account has traditionally been framed, which is to say as simply Shakespeare, the playwright who's been understood to possess an unparalleled capacity to remain in a state of unknowing, since John Keats identified that quality as his negative capability. As is likely obvious, I think the theater was a key participant in what's often been treated more narrowly as an intellectual history of skepticism. But what I found dissatisfying about the established account of the theater's involvement, focused on character and centered on Shakespeare, is that it distorts the mode of early modern performance, which was so often self-consciously presentational rather than representational, interested in attending to its own stagecraft rather than evoking the psychological depth of fictional selves. So if Hamlet's doubt is what haunts this project, in the opening paragraphs of the book, I suggest that in order to see how the early modern theater not only engaged with, but enacted the epistemological clashes of its era, we need to attend to another specter. When the ghost of Hamlet's father emerged on the Globe Theatre stage in 1600, I would venture that playgoers were invited to regard that mysterious figure, obscured beneath his suit of armor, with some skepticism. For one thing, this theater had not settled on a conventional representation for its ghosts by the opening of the 17th century. But it's also true that the spectacle of a supposedly immaterial spirit lumbering on stage in its clunky, loud suit of complete steel, as Hamlet refers to it, likely didn't announce itself as a ghost so much as exactly what it was, an actor, entirely alive and excessively material. It's in this gap between stagecraft and stage fiction, between what the play aimed to show and the tools by which the theater brought those spectacles about, that early modern playgoers were invited to inhabit opposed possibilities. And in the case of Hamlet's ghost, thereby to share in the very uncertainty that the play's characters variously exhibit about it. At its heart, then, Entertaining Uncertainty is a book about form. Because if the form that early modernity took was epistemological clash, what's distinctive about the commercial theater is that it rendered its era's essential shaping principle visible. The theatrical form that emerged within early modern England's mosaic of cultural change was itself oppositional, and more than that, acutely attuned to its opposition. All theater is at heart paradoxical, the presentation, as Bernard Beckerman puts it, of an imagined act. But the insistently meta-theatrical, highly experimental early modern theater regularly invited its spectators to dwell in that essential paradox of performance. And it did so by drawing attention to its fictional representations as theatrical presentations, its imagined acts as stagecraft. The basic argument of the book is that London's commercial theater industry prospered at the close of the 16th century because it transformed the very shape of its culture into entertainment, rendering spectacular the essential contrariety of early modernity itself. What I hope the book draws out of that claim is twofold. Each chapter takes on a different aspect of performance: bodies, props, time, space, and convention. And what I've envisioned through them is a playgoing experience that's not defined by a Brechtian model, which I think has oddly infiltrated our understanding of early modern performance despite being fundamentally anachronistic to it. And I'm here referring specifically to the alienation effect, the idea that a playgoer's absorption in an onstage fictional world is what's primary, and is that against which the sudden awareness of their estrangement from that fiction is registered. We need uncertainty to understand the nature of the more dynamic and contingent link between the early modern spectator and performance. The nearly constant awareness of the technologies of stagecraft meant that the early modern theater's fictional worlds came into being as a process of both phenomenological apprehension and interpretive suspension, those worlds emerging only at some distance from spectators. What tethered playgoers to the stage was, at heart, their uncertainty about what they saw. Second, I mean to offer the Playhouse's communal experience of uncertainty as an alternative to the solitary, even sometimes tortured experiences of doubt that otherwise characterize the intellectual history of skepticism. We might think of Augustine's anguished self-interrogations, or Montaigne's remove to his library, or Descartes' reduction of the world to his mind alone. There's a reason, of course, that the soliloquy has been so often associated with theatrical doubt. If the stakes and the risk of such doubting are high, I hope the book shows what the essential unreality of performance accomplished by contrast. Contradictory spectacles lowered the stakes of unknowing. The upending of familiar theatrical conventions both encouraged spectators' interpretive errors and freed those mistakes of material consequence. The commercial theater made the experience of uncertainty communally pleasurable, inviting playgoers to withstand the doubt endemic to a culture in the midst of thoroughgoing epistemological change. Theatrical uncertainty was entertaining, I suggest, in a doubled sense, licensing playgoers suspension among countervailing possibilities as it involved them in the process of performance itself. So I hope that provides some context for my thinking across the book's chapters. Thanks again for being here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you all for having me here. And it's been a treat to read this book and get to know Lauren's work better. And I will speak for 8 minutes. There is a passage in the third book of Proust's Remembrance of Things Past, where the narrator observes that all the productions of a particular time look alike. He goes on to say that there is nothing more evocative of passages from various novels, copies of which were displayed outside the grocery store in Cambrai when he was a child, than the decorative pattern that served as a border for certain stock certificates of the same era. It's one of those Proustian observations that instantly seems true and that you find yourself, or at least I find myself, repeating all the time because confirmations of its truth begin to appear everywhere. Still, I had never found occasion to apply this observation to early modern drama until I read Lauren Robertson's book. One of the most remarkable things about entertaining uncertainty in the early modern theater is its fluid, seamless movement, often in the course of a single paragraph or even a single sentence, between the culture of the commercial theater and the culture of early modern England more broadly. Between, on the one hand, the tiny props, the still and kinetic and disguised bodies, the lively, then hollowed out, then re-enlivened dramatic conventions that made the stage a world apart. And on the other, the civic and religious rituals, the medical and scientific and legal texts, the political controversies, and the sermons, poetry, and popular literature that defined the playgoer's world. As Lauren unfortunately just said, the book takes as its premise that the commercial theater and the culture in which it arose were epistemologically akin. They shared, that is, the same basic form. This premise is borne out on every page of the book, and to my mind allows Robertson to demonstrate with enviable persuasiveness that the reigns of three monarchs and the evident evolution of stage conventions and audience response notwithstanding, early modern drama, broadly considered, is a discrete and unified aesthetic and social phenomenon. Another remarkable thing about entertaining uncertainty, and the thing I like best about it, is its magnificent parade of examples. The heavy tread of Hamlet's armored ghost, Pisanio squinting after Posthumus's waving handkerchief, the empty and waiting chairs at the beginning of the banquet scene in Macbeth, the stuttering characters and their impersonators in Look About You and Marston's What You Will, the death of Henry IV in the famous victories of Henry V, simulated darkness in The Night Walker, the elusive opening of Edward II and the speculative conclusion of Perkin Warbeck, and the murky miniature picture in Massinger's A Picture. These are just a few of the examples Robertson marshals to explore the myriad ways in which playwrights and their audiences deployed and navigated uncertainty as the animating principle of theatrical meaning and pleasure. Here again, the book is fluent and seamless in its movement among the familiar plays of Shakespeare and the less familiar, often downright obscure plays of his contemporaries. Robertson's Catholic attitude toward plays and playwrights is both the ground of and necessitated by her interest in the evolution as well as the recursiveness of dramatic conventions. And this sort of broad lens approach to the plays of the period is the methodological realization of her ambitious claim that London's commercial theater industry transformed the very shape of its culture into entertainment. It rendered the essential contrariety of early modernity spectacular. Robertson's sustained engagement with the period's lesser known plays makes clear both how much those plays have to offer and how much we can learn from her as a reader of dramatic language, action, and possibility. I was particularly dazzled by her discussion of Massinger's The Picture, the hit. This is the sleeper hit of this year, the Picture. I think everyone's going to want to read it after this session. And now you can, because it's in an anthology. So there's no excuse to ignore this thing. On page 120, Robertson writes that, quote, Massinger deliberately exaggerates the miniature picture's failure to lay bare Sophia's thoughts. This picture is supposed to tell you whether or not this woman is adulterous or just thinking adulterous thoughts. So Massinger deliberately exaggerates its failure in order to offer up the soliloquy as a key theatrical means by which her mind might be successfully accessed. After reading this, I scribbled in the margin, but access still requires interpretation. Skeptical reader. 2 pages later, I found that my note had been anticipated, perhaps even lured out of me by Robertson's carefully structured argument. Soliloquies, she writes on page 122, are an interpretive trap, the means by which Massinger lures spectators into a false sense of confidence that they can dive into Sophia's hidden thoughts. From here, she unfolds a brilliant demonstration of how the play dramatizes the uncertainty of Sophia's motives by implying and then withholding a retributive bed trick plot. Quote, the unmediated access to the mysteries of Sophia's mind, she writes on 123, is intertheatrically construed as the correct anticipation of the play's plot. I made a margin note here too. It consists of 2 vertical lines and then an asterisk and an exclamation point. The delights of reading entertaining uncertainty are akin to those of reading early modern plays. Surprise and discovery, sudden reversals, unexpected synthesis. At times, Robertson seems to be giving us virtually a first-hand account of the phenomenological intertwining of the early modern theater with the culture of which it was a part. She writes like a historian and thinks like a playwright. I will conclude my remarks by asking a question that is shamelessly connected to my own work and more particularly to my upcoming participation in an SAA seminar on forsaken plays as non-canonical and obscure early modern plays. Like Lauren, I think I am interested in moments of theatrical failure or inefficacy, moments where clarity becomes obscurity, where conventions run out of steam, where audience expectations are thwarted or unmet. At the same time, I am, and I think we share this interest as well, interested in recuperation, in bringing as many formerly overlooked plays as possible to bear on the discussion of early modern theatricality. The problem I always have is in dovetailing these 2 interests around the question of critical judgment, ours or more urgently, that of the historical audience. I wonder whether and to what extent, for example, it is important for the argument of entertaining uncertainty, whether and to what extent this kind of the question of critical judgment is important to the argument of entertaining uncertainty. Webster's White Devil, for example, is mentioned 3 times in the book, as a descendant of the Spanish tragedy, as a play that makes surprising use of the well-worn convention of reanimation, characters assumed to be dead, and as a play that gestures toward but does not deploy the convention of the revenge mask or the murder mask. Does it matter, I wondered, for this book's discussion of play's capacity to reflect the culture and to convert uncertainty into pleasure? Does it matter that this play seems not to have pleased its first audience and was perhaps not performed again after its premiere? And indeed, that this might well have been the case for most of the plays performed during the period. That's something I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about that. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. Very pleased to be here tonight. I will probably speak for slightly less than 8 minutes to give everybody else more time. When I was teaching in Vancouver in 2006, I went with a group of professors to see a production of Twelfth Night at the very unfortunately named Bard on the Beach, a Shakespeare festival, literally on the beach in Vancouver. At the end of the performance, the character playing Viola Cesario, one of the most famous cross-dressed characters in Shakespeare's oeuvre, came on stage dressed explicitly against the play's diegetic and extra-diegetic instructions in women's clothes. We all, to a person, gasped aloud, clasped our pearls, soliciting daggers from all the people sitting next to us, making ourselves highly unpopular. In the play as written, Viola Cesario remains on stage, dressed as a male page through the end. A fact that's central not only to the story as written, but to the pleasures, both erotic and theatrical, the theater-going pleasures of that play. I think about this moment all the time and have never had an adequate way of understanding it, other than the rather obvious fact that we knew the play better than the people putting it on. It's not, I think, immodest to say, however, that that is not an infrequent occurrence of any scholar going to the theater, and that we all did, in some form or another, gender or queer critique. So we were literally clasping our pearls. One of the pleasures of reading Lauren's new book is that it gives me a number of new ways in which to understand that moment, and more importantly, a number of new ways in which to understand what happens on the early modern stage writ large. Lauren discusses Twelfth Night in her chapter on space, which reveals the way in which early modern playwrights use the architecture of the playhouse and the spatial dynamics of the stage, often quite literally, the entrances and the exits, and the tiring or the dressing house into and from which characters exit and reappear, to produce a form of impersonation that relies on the partial knowledge of spatial manipulation and the recessive places of the stage. The doors that lead, as Lauren puts it, to, quote, unseen elsewheres beyond the stage, help to produce not only epistemological uncertainty about identity, my previous concern, but also, and this primarily on stage, depictions of the intersubjectivity or interrelationality of identity. We know Sebastian the impersonated only through his relationship with his impersonator. If the playgoing space is divided into onstage presence and offstage absence, we get to enjoy not only the occasional traces of impersonation left behind for discovery, the beard and counterfeited hair in the amply named Look About You, but also the onstage encounter between Cesario and Viola's brother Sebastian. And this is a quotation from the play. Do not embrace me till each circumstance of place, time, fortune do cohere, that I am Viola, Cesario tells Sebastian. Their joint appearance a signal to spectators that the play's comic resolution approaches, and this is the part that explains our reaction at Bard on the Beach, a refusal of the uncertainty of that arrival. Lauren's point is that the relegation of the impersonated character offstage invites us to evaluate him in the wake of the imposter's performance. The imposter, that is, has primacy. Their clothing, voice, and gait train us to recognize the counterfeited and thus teach us that there's no clear distinction between persons. An experience that, as Lauren puts it, radiates that destabilizing duplicity back to the playhouse. While others have argued that the early modern stage produced a theater-going population acutely in turn to the repertory and tropes of that theatrical culture, and trained them to be rewarded for it, returning again and again and again to the theater. Lauren instead shows the ways in which early modern playwrights, including Shakespeare, twisted that convention by thwarting playgoers' raised expectations about what was to come. The coming of the trope tuned them in, but the narrative surprise, the uncertainty of where the narrative would go, was what kept them coming back. What I like about this argument vis-a-vis Twelfth Night is that what had hitherto been an argument about, for me, about the queerness of the stage, a stage that took boys for women, and thus an ideological, say, or thematic, or identitarian, or in some ways historical argument, becomes in Lauren's hands an argument about the theater's mechanisms, some quite literally mechanical, for exploiting uncertainty as a key theatrical pleasure. Uncertainty is rewarded not by its obviation, that is, but by its plenitude. The disruption of well-established conventions like the cross-dressed heroine reappearing as a heroine in women's clothes at the end of the play is experienced by what Lauren calls a jolt of unknowing. And the jolt, she argues, dashes interpretive security, and this unbalancing constitutes the entertainment of uncertainty, the thesis of her book. While the power of all drama lies in its ability to solicit effective and interpretive responses in its spectators by upending dramatic expectations, Lauren argues that the tightly inter- and intra-theatrical referentiality of the early modern theatrical repertory, well-known plays, rarely known or rarely seen plays, produced a kind of theatrical literacy in playgoers that found its greatest reward not in being satisfied in recognition, but in having them taken in a wholly new direction. One of the things I found when I was finishing reading the book, as I was thinking about Shakespeare, I was thinking about other scenes of intimacy and closeness that I feel like some of the theories of this book would explain. The one I was thinking about was between Iago and Othello, where Iago says to Othello, "I see this hath little dashed your spirits." And Othello says, "Not a jot, not a jot." And I was wondering what you have to say about the ways in which the stage, you talk both about Blackfriars, the smaller ones, and the wide open amphitheaters, how obsessed the plays often are with drawing people closer to look at what's happening on people's faces, so that there's all kinds of epistemological uncertainties that are answered not by, as you keep saying, not by forensic certitude, right? But by keeping the question open in a way that we're not already directed towards the answer. Okay. So thank you.
Thank you, Lauren, for inviting me to talk about your book, which I read with great delight. And tonight, I want to think about one of the book's, I think, maybe unremarked conceptual through lines, one that connects entertaining uncertainty in the early modern theater with the shifting landscape of contemporary theater, and especially with still unresolved dimensions of the critique of a special subset of theater, dramatic performance. As Artaud complained in his famous essay, No More Masterpieces, in the literary imagination, the play, the drama, the poetry is conceived as the privileged instigator of theater, the dimension of the performance that lends its practice significance, cultural power, and longevity, meaning. That is, as Artaud recognized avant la lettre, for most people, especially in the era of printed plays, logocentric theater is theater. Despite the widespread impact of Artaud's thinking on how we make and understand theater today, this feeling for the work of theater remains deeply dyed in the study of theater and drama. Poets are makers, creators, maybe even unacknowledged legislators, but their theatrical colleagues are something else. The polite term most often used today is practitioners. I want to open my thoughts about Lauren's engagement with dramatic theater by noticing the frequency and variety of her use of this word, practitioners, and by pausing to think about early modern theater as an event, an uncertainly entertaining event, composed by a cast of practitioners. It's not a term Shakespeare and company would have used for themselves, though it was available at the time, often used for lawyers, people who have an occupation. And while T.S. Eliot described Dryden as a poetic practitioner who learned from Johnson, I'd say that the widespread application of this term to theatrical artists dates more recently. The OED has an apposite citation to 1987. For better and worse, referring to theater makers as practitioners today marks what Shannon Jackson once described as a conceptual or ideological tension between what she called the intellectual and the manual, on which so much humanistic meaning-making relies. The intellectual and the manual, the poetic and the practical, the creative and the executive. In other performance media, say film, where the screenplay has a different location in the armature of production than is attributed to the dramatic script, it would seem odd to preserve these hierarchies, to refer to the actors, directors, cinematographers as mere practitioners. But in the humanities, theater often appears under the sign of the masterpiece, where the poetic origin of the durable work is protected from those who merely practice on or through it. I'm pulling this thread because I think Lauren's book works in a different direction, one that has implications for early modern theater and drama studies and beyond them too. Lauren also takes, and here I'm quoting, theatrical apprehensions simultaneously imaginative and interpretive to depend on the smooth transition of meaning from stage to audience. This interpretive sense of theater, though, is conceived through the engagement of writers in and among practitioners and enables a specific kind of entanglement. Entertaining Uncertainty imagines the text not so much as instigating others' practices as collaborating with their formality, in a sense as a piece of software that, with an imaginative engagement of what we know about the operating system of performance, could be used to reverse engineer the complex interactive machine of which it was once a part. Used by the hardware of theater and the technologies of acting, the practiced script locates early modern spectators as something other than mere participants. They too are sophisticated practitioners of a processual event, one here characterized by its distinctive modes of uncertainty. Entertaining Uncertainty is rich in its reading of familiar and unfamiliar moments. Here's one. Although a stage direction in Henry IV, Part 1 suggests that Falstaff, quote, falls down as if he were dead, that as if is undecidedly imperative addressed to the actor or indicative describing what the character does. But in the pit, what's the difference to us of that as if? After all, both actors on stage playing Hotspur and Falstaff do just that, fall down as if dead. That as if points to a hardware problem. In a theater in which dead bodies are practically removed from the stage, Hamlet lugging the guts that used to be Polonius to another room, Falstaff's rise from the stage is a moment of focused theatrical uncertainty, where, to speak in the old ways, the tenor and the vehicle have become uncertainly reversible. In his theater, Falstaff's death is grooved to a different machinery than, say, Sam's death in Pinter's Homecoming. According to one of the characters, he was dead for about 30 seconds or so. Hal's failure to lug the huge guts off stage troubles the as-if gap we observe between actor and character, as though as-if marked an ontological rather than a merely practical or important practical decision. Left on stage, the weightless character has no way off other than through the reanimation of the performer, and yet the actor standing up and walking off marks the end of the character. Leaving the body on stage threatens not so much what Falstaff fears, that Hotspur will arise, as something else, that our mutual practice of the play will be broken. It's a pleasure that Shakespeare's stage frequently risks. Oh, heavy sight. Think about those boy actors playing Cleopatra and Charmian and Iris, joking through their heavy grief as they haul the heavy actor playing Antony aloft. Will they drop him? What then? The delicate liveliness of dramatic character is uncertainly distributed across the body of the actor, simultaneously sustained and betrayed by that weight. Lauren's investment in the spectator's practice is visible in her attention to the dynamics of seeing in the early modern theater. Whereas, say, Nora Helmer's upwardly striving parlor is part of a fully bourgeoisified material social world that begins just outside the practical door of the proscenium stage, the tiring house doors of an early modern theater frame a boundary between spaces of essential transformability. The sterile promontory of the thrust stage, its elsewhere, anywhere, nowhere, symmetrical with the everywhere, anywhere, nowhere through the upstage doors. There's doors that I suppose might sometimes play the part of doors, Gertrude's closet maybe, but are often just a theatrical prop hedging the dramatic scene. I don't think there are doors in the Forest of Arden. This fluid interiority maps the fluid interiority of characterization, the transformation of stage objects, of actors, and implicitly of the spectatorial subjects of performance, those everyone's, anyone's, and no one's in the pit. Entertaining uncertainty is rich in this kind of reading, how to engage theatrical history when the events on stage keep moving in and out of the historical, where the verification of sight means that the objects too small for sight that we see on stage are doing what the characters say they're doing, where the theater frames an emerging community of actors and audiences regularly mediated by playing together. We can build a new globe on the Bankside, restore original practices to modern practitioners, but we are not transformed. What Lauren provides here, I think, is a way to see into a place we are no longer able to inhabit, and into a practice we are no longer able to take up. As she puts it, the theater transformed uncertainty from a state to be traversed or merely endured into the very satisfaction of spectators' expectations. That is to say, the pleasure of practicing theater. Thank you.
Lauren, do you have anything to say?
Sure. Yeah, I have some thoughts. Thank you so much, Jeremy, Julie, and Bill. I'm overwhelmed by those really generous readings of the book. Maybe I'll start actually with Bill, since it seemed to me that some of your descriptions were kind of maybe offering a way into Jeremy's question about the White Devil and other moments of theatrical failure. So I'll start there. I mean, I love this, I think this way of describing the enterprise of theater as a kind of software that glitched a lot in early modernity. I mean, it's those moments of glitching that I'm really interested in. When one of the questions that I was grappling with as I worked through this project was the question of sort of what role the audience has in the making of meaning across live performance. And I think, different people have different ideas about how involved the audience was. I think by the end of the book, I've come down on the side that I do think the audience was involved in that process of making meaning, although it seems to me that theater practitioners in the period are sort of just as interested in both inviting that kind of interpretive involvement and frustrating it at key moments. That very involvement is precisely the kind of resistance to the making of sense at key moments in the play. And so that kind of attention to the glitch, the sort of moment when there's a kind of interruption in that smooth transmission of meaning from stage to audience, is exactly, I think, the kind of theatrical failure that plays risk, especially the plays that we don't consider masterpieces or that didn't make it beyond a single performance. We don't know exactly why the White Devil failed. I mean, right, Webster thinks it's because the weather was bad. But it certainly is, I mean, it's of a piece with this kind of project, I think, absolutely, that if one of the things the theater is interested in doing is suspending the possibility for audience judgment, too much of that risks failure. We're lucky, I think, to be able to see an example of a play that I think may have done the same thing in the period in New York this season, The Night of the Burning Pestle, that there's just sort of, that's a play where so much is demanded of the audience in the kind of moment by moment unfolding of performance. So many sort of expectations about how theater works are being gleefully upended in that play. That seems also to have been a total flop, right? So that's, I think, a kind of extreme place, certainly, that the kinds of examples I'm looking at in the book can take a playhouse to, absolutely. the question of kind of intimacy and closeness to, just as I'm thinking about it out loud, strikes me as another place that risks failure and often generates it. That I think one of the, this is something that I say to students all the time, so you're going to hear me say it again, but I think one of the things that makes theater in this period interesting is that it's honest about our opacity to one another, that the sort of the terror of another person not being knowable runs through so many of the plays, and of course that's the problem in Othello as well. That was something that I was trying to think through in that chapter on space as being, of course, a problem that unfolds on the stage, but also that unfolds in the playhouse as well. That if there's something like the emergence of a theatrical community by the end of the 1590s, it's the emergence of a community that also doesn't know itself, or is sort of coming together socially without having full knowledge of itself. So I do think that there's a kind of both wish for that sort of intimacy and knowingness on an intersubjective level on the stage, that it's precisely that sort of frustrated process that is being transferred to audience members. And that is sort of paradoxically, I think, kind of constitutive of audience community, certainly at the end of the 1590s. And that's, you know, before, I think, the kind of moment that's more commonly talked about in this period, when by the 1620s or 30s, say, there's a theater going community that does recognize itself and knows what it's about. At an earlier moment, in the moment of performance, I think there's more uncertainty and more unknowing about that's happening at the level of the play going community. Yeah.
Do you resist? I mean, one of the moves you make is people often want to differentiate the small playhouses from local. And you really resist that, despite, you know, you make a good case for why the physical plant matters, and then you also make a case that that often people want to say that a particular playing company or a particular theater created its own community. I mean, that was Mary Bly's argument, or, you know, and you really eschew those arguments. I'm wondering if that felt like a sort of a bigger part of your agenda.
I think that historical argument that I'm thinking about can be mapped on pretty easily to those different kinds of spaces, right? That if we're thinking mostly about the outdoor amphitheater, the larger theater, we're thinking about an earlier moment in the history of theater than those later hall performances that allow for a kind of intimacy that the amphitheaters don't necessarily. So yeah, I do think there's been more thought given, I think, to the ways that smaller, more intimate space, the more exclusive space, generates a kind of community than the amphitheater that is more often described as a kind of social free-for-all, right? But the kind of playgoing community that makes possible, I think, is one that is worth thinking through, and that makes room for perhaps more unknowing in the creation of that community itself.
Okay, so I think it's time to open up to all of you. Who has some questions or comments? Peter?
You know, I love this one. Oh, am I doing this? Oh dear. All right. What I love is the rewriting of the idea of the soliloquy as a moment of inwardness and access to the self. And part of me needs to believe in the model that you're taking on, because, and I don't think it's wrong, because Montaigne's essays come in, and to some extent we get inwardness and we get deeper and deeper soliloquies. But I think you're right that the soliloquy can become a place of communal making of meaning. And here's where I think Bill and I have been arguing about this for a long time. I think that the early modern conditions of performance that the Globe has taught us vis-a-vis the soliloquy brings home your point. When you first saw, because I remember the skepticism about the Globe as going to be this Disneyland, and in fact, nobody believes that now, but I had a lot of conversations with some of my colleagues here about that when it was still being built. When we got to see the soliloquy at the Globe and from productions that came from the Globe, you realize that it was a communal thing. The way that they play to the audience broke down that idea that this was a Montaigne inward moment. It was, you have to help us make the meaning, and we can do it. And this is us and not just me. So I think that that's a place where early modern performance conditions actually help your argument. And it was shocking to me when I first saw those Globe plays. The other thing I wanted to say, because no one else was speaking, then I hope I started the ball rolling, is that Shakespeare, early-ish and late, but early-ish in the comedies, let's say, with Love's Labour's Lost and Midsummer Night's Dream, stages failure, right? And it's the audience that is part of the failure, right? It's the audiences that won't go with the company. And it's failure writ large. But I think that's part of it. I think of those moments when I think of your larger, more sophisticated idea of theatrical failure. Yeah, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a really helpful way of describing the sort of theatrical resources of the soliloquy, in particular on the thrust stage. I remember in a class teaching Titus Andronicus, I showed a clip from a Globe performance of Aaron's soliloquy, and the response to that was, I think the first person said, it's like stand-up comedy. I mean, so it's just a sort of totally different understanding of the kind of dynamism of those moments that complicate, I think, a sense of that theatrical device as being an unmediated source of access to a character's mind. And I think what's really great about Sophia's soliloquies in The Picture, which is a really excellent play, and everyone should read it, in the new Routledge Anthology of Early Modern Drama, is the way that sort of sense of a kind of collaboration between audience and character that's happening at that moment is both invited and thwarted at this very late moment in the commercial theater's history. I think The Picture is 1629. So there's a set of expectations by that late moment that that spectators perhaps are being drawn into a kind of collaborative project with her across those speeches. And then what's so brilliant about that play then in particular is that I think the message that we ultimately get from it is exactly what Sophia's husband fears about her, which is that her mind is opaque to him. He doesn't have complete access to her, nor do spectators. And yet somehow that opacity becomes unthreatening or becomes neutralized by the end of the play. I mean, one of the sort of, if Hamlet is one figure that haunts this project, Stanley Cavell is maybe the other one. And so one of the things that I was trying to do in that chapter especially was sort of think through a kind of more capacious understanding of who gets to doubt and who is doubted in early modern drama. So often it's women who are doubted, and in Cavell's formulation, it's male characters who doubt. That's a play I think that sort of totally upends that kind of truism while kind of refusing access ultimately to her. So it's a good one. Thanks.
Gene Howard.
Thank you very much for this. One thing I love about your book, Lauren, is how thoroughly you lean into the presentational aspects of early modern drama. And I also love the way you mixed Shakespeare with all these other playwrights. But I did want to press a little bit on Jeremy's question about why some things remain and some don't, why some seem to have been popular and others less so. Was it just the weather or something else to do with your thesis about doubt? Is there any way in which a compounding of doubt in a play makes it not able to be received in the, the audience's meaning-making power just is too thwarted? Is that true for Night of the Burning Pestle? I just want you to say a bit more about the variations we have in the archive that remains to us between plays that seem to have been popular and plays that weren't. And is that question at all related to your deep concerns with skepticism and doubt, or is that just not something you can answer from within your framework?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. I think in some ways, probably yes. So sort of if a kind of too much compounding of doubt risks losing an audience's involvement entirely. But I think the other thing I would say about that is that what seems to me sort of the most potent examples of uncertainty at the presentational level, right, are the ones that become imbricated and sort of work synergistically perhaps with what's happening in the play itself. So when there is some kind of interaction between the presentational and the representational, that seems to me where the most potent sort of possibility for spectators' doubt is. Just to take an example that has already been mentioned, right? When Falstaff is there on stage seemingly dead, and Hal it's a scene that I think constructs a series of false exits. So the elegy that Prince Hal gives to Falstaff in that moment includes several rhyming couplets, which would seem right to like snap the scene shut. That's how closing couplets work. I think every time that happened, Hal tries to carry Falstaff off the stage. So the scene is sort of trying to end and not ending, right? And it works because Prince Hal is a failure, right? Up until then, he's been a failure in so many ways. Now suddenly he's failing at the level of just basic stage business, right? And so it's that, I think, that moment of failure on the stage that suddenly starts offering a new kind of insight into the thematic or diegetic failure, perhaps. If there's a kind of way for that sort of moment to become lasting, I think it's through that kind of connection.
Seth Williams.
One of the things that I love about your title is its pun. And I'm wondering if you could help us to understand the contours of your argument a little better by explaining where that pun stops working, either by not working when we're talking about other forms of literature or other performing arts, or perhaps other periods of dramatic production. Is there something about your argument that comes into view when that wonderful title stops working?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I think, I do think that I guess ironically, sort of take the entertaining as in fun part of the pun really seriously. I think that that I'm really trying to make a distinction between the kinds of doubting that we're maybe more familiar with as solitary or torturous somehow, and as stymieing in some ways as a result, right? The difference between Hamlet's own doubting and our experience of the play when we watch it, our spectators' experience of the play, right? So I do think that for the entertaining as consideration or as a kind of trying out to work, that other sense of entertaining is really necessary. One of the things I think that the theater does so well or in such interesting ways is sort of transform the kind of stasis of uncertainty into something that sort of simply due to the construction of live performance has to be gotten through or moved through. And there's a way in which I think the pleasurable aspect of entertainment is the kind of motivating force for that forward momentum, and is maybe another way I distinguish the sort of stasis that Hamlet feels when he's giving the to be or not to be speech versus the kind of transformation of uncertainty into theatrical possibility, the sort of plenitude of possibility that's encompassed when spectators are asked to consider opposed possibilities, right? The multiple turns that a play might take at any given moment. There's a kind of propulsive effect that's part of both senses of entertainment, I think. Thanks.
I was wondering with respect.
Like, what do actors know? And how do they know it? Is that is that a way of asking the question?
Well, I guess in your book, I haven't read your book.
That's okay. You're asking from a position of unknowingness, and that's ideal, I think.
I guess I'm asking the question of the epistemic position in terms of internal or external placement of epistemic knowledge. How we know based off of the play, or is it based off of the actor, or I don't know. I'm curious what your book might have to say about that kind of argument, philosophical argument, one side.
Yeah, I think it has to be both. I mean, I think there's an interaction between text and player that's always, of course, happening through what Bill, I think, rightly and provocatively describes as the kind of eventness of performance, right? That really more than thinking about text, I'm interested in thinking about about the play as an event that then necessarily includes both actors and audience in a kind of active role in making and frustrating meaning across the event. I mean, the other kind of practical way that question might be thought through, or the question of actors' knowingness, I think becomes especially interesting in plays of this period, is that it's been suggested that players sort of come to rehearsal or come to performance with comparatively sort of little knowledge about how the play as a whole unfolds, because really they've been spending most of their time alone with only their part, right? Not the entire text of the play. So there's a kind of intensity to that sort of eventness when the knowledge that's being produced is happening in the moment to some extent, not only for the people in the playhouse, but for the people on stage as well. That kind of project of knowingness and the frustration of it is heightened in that regard, I think. Yeah, great. Well, you've read it, so
Right.
yeah, you can. I read it.
But it's also that those actors are coming with the repertoire. Like they're coming with the roles that they've played, just like the audience is coming with their knowledge of the roles they've played, right?
Yeah,
and
so-
that seems to matter.
Yeah, I think so. If there's a way, I think that I'd revise that sort of well-worn truism that as playgoers get more theatrically literate through the Caroline era. They're more aware of the conventions that the theater is using, right? It's precisely that sort of increased amount of knowledge that makes the upending of those conventions that much more potent. So it's a kind of dynamic process of knowing and unknowing that I think continues even through the late moment.
It continues like beyond the end of the play, right? Right. I was thinking earlier. You said the I'm really compelled by this idea of like the embrace of or embrace. Maybe that's not the right word, but that the theater kind of confronts head on the problem of like opacity of mind, right? And that then gets kind of diffused into all these different kinds of conventions of uncertainty. And but then like we were talking about the end of the picture. You said that the uncertainty, Sophia's husband and the audience arrive at sort of the same place with respect to Sophia's mind, but that it's that uncertainty, like it's the terror it holds for Matthias is like neutralized or something. But I was thinking like probably not neutralized actually. Right? I mean that actually the exciting thing about the end of that play is it's like, well, there's going to have to be this ongoing social relationship of marriage that takes into account the opacity of minds, right? I mean, it's not so what the play gestures towards is actually an ongoing negotiation more than like a neutralization, which presumably in the best plays probably does like pass on to the audience as well, right? That feeling that something is going to continue to happen after even the event of the performance. Like you can imagine.
Yeah, I think that's really right. And I mean, she acknowledges that even, right? When by the end of the play, when she's saying, well, the thing she doubts is whether he's going to keep doubting her, right? That remains a kind of open question by the end of the play. So yeah, I mean, I think a formulation that's been really important to me as I've worked on the book is, Alan Sinfield's idea, right, that any sort of neat bow a play tries to sort of tie off by Act 5 doesn't negate or foreclose the more open-ended possibilities that the middle of the play brings up, right? And I think that works on this level as well, that especially when we take theatrical pleasure into account, that if the most exciting moment of a play is what's been revealed to an audience member as their incorrect judgment or a moment of uncertainty about what that ghost in his clunky armor actually is, right? That those things continue on even after the resolutions that ends of plays are meant to bring about.
I wonder, and you're thinking about acting in terms of repertoire and acting in terms of a repertory of roles, in the sense that actors tend to play similar kinds of things, and the discussion of Lowen toward the end is so great. But I wonder, the other thing that one might assume is that part of the uncertainty of going to a play would be seeing somebody who got his part 3 days ago. And that there's a way in which I think, the imagination of this theatrical experience being crafted to the text in the way modern production is, I think actually forecloses that notion of the audience sort of being there and filling in the gaps of things that maybe look gappier than they seem to us today, And I think that's part of, in reading this book, I was impressed by the sense in which you talk about the performance, not only that the middle retains its middleness when we get to the end, but that it's always unfinished as it's going forward. And that's really, I think, a provocative idea.
Thank you. That's a really interesting way of thinking about it. I'm thinking now about Peter's earlier point about Midsummer and the failures at the level of performance that the play is thinking about, and then asking for a kind of additional level of sympathetic response on the part of its audience. But in some ways that feels like a kind of preemptive response to exactly this. There's a kind of not only increased interpretive demand on the part of spectators, but a kind of sympathetic response that's required for a bunch of people who have been given the text of a new play 3 days ago or something. But yeah, that's part of the project. That might be related to the kind of question about compounding doubt, right? That there's a demand on the part of audience members that increases the more that happens. And one of the things we've been sort of tracing is when that breaks, right? When that demand can no longer be responded to adequately. Yeah.
Should I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Are you able to use this sort of approach in your teaching? Because I like uncertainty, but I've found that my students are not keen on uncertainty. I get a lot of evaluations that say that the professor seems not to know the answer, which I think is a strength, but they don't.
Well, students who have, I don't know, listened to me try out some of these arguments in classes that we've been in together, maybe you have more to say. But, oh gosh, at the risk of sounding smug, I think it kind of works. It works sometimes. I think that what feels like becomes an opportunity for thinking on this level is when we think at the level of performance possibility. So one that I really love and will definitely be familiar to people in this room is from a play called The Second Maiden's Tragedy, where there's this just totally bonkers scene that includes both a dead character's body and her ghost, who has come on stage, right, to say, please deal with this. Why am I not in my tomb where I belong, right? And so the questions for performance become really fascinating there. Who's playing the corpse? Who's playing the ghost? Is it the same, what actor have we already seen? That again, right, to Jean's point earlier, these sort of questions about uncertainty in performance overlap then with questions about uncertainty in the play. And is, I think, a place where something like uncertainty, once it becomes a question about theatrical possibility, is where it feels like at the kind of pedagogical level, there's a way forward then. In the same way that it becomes a way forward sort of when you're watching the play itself, perhaps.
Great. Do we have any more questions? No? Then if we don't, then I want to thank our distinguished panel, Bill Worthen, Julie Crawford, and Jeremy Lopez, and thank Lauren, of course, for informing us about her book, which we're all going to go and buy now. Thank you all for coming and for all your questions. It's a very fascinating discussion. Thank you.
Thanks.